the point where I realised we were facing a climate emergency, I was working as a government employee in a specialist psychology service, Spectrum, working with people with borderline personality disorder, so people with terribly strong and difficult emotions who often were making unwise choices, and we were refining our treatment for those. So now I mostly work as a volunteer on the climate emergency, but I still do a bit of training. I'm just going to start with a couple of the slides I still use in training, because I'm going to talk about climate messaging, but my background is basically in my own experience of what works to move people to action. So yeah, this is one of my favourite training slides. It's about acceptance and commitment therapy. And we use it all the time, well, I used to, in groups, therapy groups, but also all the time in training. Accept your thoughts and feelings and be present. It's to do with looking reality in the eye, letting your feelings be there. Choose action in line with your values, take action. And it's what you do that counts, it's not how you feel. And as time goes on, making wise choices, taking wise action will make you feel better than just trying to make your feelings change. So this is my background. The other thing that we use all the time in our training is that if you want people to change, if you want people to take action, don't link it to some little thing about you'll be healthier or something like that. Link it to the biggest, broadest, most overarching value that you can find. And the interesting thing is that all over the world, pretty much everybody, rich, poor, Asian, African, Australian, from Russia, from China, they all basically have the same values. When people are on their deathbed, the things they care about are what were my relationships like with those that I loved, and did I make a difference in the world? Like, even if it was just, cleaning people's houses, was I doing something useful? Was I doing something to make the world a better place? And you'll find rich people who spend their life making money, and you could say their value is somehow making money. We wouldn't say that, because on their deathbed, they'll go, I shouldn't have spent so much time making money, I should have spent more time with my kids, I wish I had. People are the same. So, this is where I start from. This is what I know. And the other thing we say in our training really often is, don't trust what I say, trust what your experience tells you. So, when it came to climate messaging, I didn't trust what people were telling me, I trusted what I knew. And I'll tell you about that. So, we're at a point in history where, sadly, the truth is actually frightening. So, to just summarise it very briefly, there's a lot of things that show the Earth is already too hot. It's not some problem that's in the future. There's a lot to show that some immoral billionaires are quite knowingly prepared to send us to destruction. I don't understand their psychology very well, but I think that there's no doubt that's what they're prepared to do. There's a lot of talk, and has been since at least 2007, about tipping points and whether we're past them. There's no doubt we're running out of time to act. So we've got to make big changes fast. If we're already too hot, it's pretty clear we've got to get to zero emissions fast as we possibly can, and then we've got to go backwards. Like, it used to be acknowledged in the climate movement, like 350.org. Like, 350 was below where we were, right? You've got to get to zero and go down. I don't know whether most people who signed up for 350.org understood that, but that's why they were called 350.org, because we had to get to zero and then go down. Beyond zero emissions used to be called Zero Emissions Now, but they realised it wasn't strong enough. This was back in about 2008 or 9. They called it Beyond Zero Emissions, because you've got to get to zero and then do more. In Australia, with Climate Code Red back in 2007, how come the message didn't get out? Well, there's quite a few obstacles, but the biggest one we face is that there's some very powerful, very wealthy people who are prepared to spread lies. And they buy newspapers and they buy TV channels and they pay people like Andrew Bolt to spread things that they know are lies. And we would have got ahead a lot faster if we went up against really powerful people telling lies. So I won't go into that much more. But the thing about them is that they do know they're telling lies. This is not their right-wing values showing through. This is their greed and self-interest throwing through, and that is not a right-wing value. That is a failure to access your values. Now, there's another whole set of problems, which I won't go into it in a lot of detail, but David Spratt goes into them, which is basically scientific reticence. It's scientists understating the case. And it's not because they're dishonest, they're very well intentioned. But it's partly because of just how science is set up, that you have to be very, very sure before you say anything. That the IPCC relies on models. To put a thing in the model, you've got to be able to sort of mathematically calculate how that's sort of going to go. And things like how fast the ice is going to be melting, it's not very easy to calculate, so you leave it out of your model. But then you publish a report that's got calculations about sea level rise that's based on your model. It's bound to be under. And somewhere in those IPCC reports you will find sentences that go, oh, well, of course, this is an underestimate, right? But then you go to your local council, if you're by the sea, and they're using the estimate and they're missing that really complicated sentence which says something like the upper bound should not be considered the upper bound, because the IPCC is giving them no guidance about, well, what figures should they be using? So there's things like that. There's also things like what's called the Mercer effect. So this was a guy, John Mercer, a really eminent Antarctic scientist, climatologist, who way back said, look, I think Antarctica is going to melt. Well, he turned out to be right. He was ahead of his times. Most people thought that Antarctica would not melt. He was pilloried. He lost his job. He was persecuted. So this is the Mercer effect. You have to be very, very brave as a scientist to make a strong prediction. When Hansen does it these days, he writes a paper, James Hansen, and he puts about 20 co-authors on it. He gets the most eminent co-authors that he can find, because he knows if he wants to put something strong into the scientific literature, he's going to be kicked half to death unless he's got 20 people backing him up. That's quite hard. There's another paper, little article he wrote, just about how he was made to take the word dangerous out of the heading of his scientific paper. They would not publish it until he took the word dangerous out, right? It's because in science there's great value in sort of rationality, and that's for good reason. You don't want scientists being driven by their emotions. You want scientists, examining the facts for us. But it means that scientists are in the habit of communicating things with a lot of uncertainty and without much emotion. That's what they're trained to do. That's sort of good, but it's sort of bad when it comes to climate. The other thing that makes science... Well, there's another couple of things. One other thing that makes scientists reticent is that they are literally having their lives and their families' lives threatened by these bloody self-interested billionaires, basically, by people paid by them. We went to see David Caroli to talk to him at one point. They had to take his name, and this is what they do with the climate scientists more generally, off all the notice boards and off his door because of threats to his life. So, you can understand then why scientists are not busting to get in the media. Think of what happened to Michael Mann, the hockey stick guy. He has been persecuted by these people. ClimateGate, when they got hacked and all their emails got sort of spread around and misinterpreted. So there's lots of reasons why scientists don't speak out and don't really say how bad it is. Another reason is that all the money, 2 degrees was set as basically a political target. All the money for research is around, well, what would 2 degrees mean? How can we avoid 2 degrees? No one ever researched what 1 degree would mean. Coral scientists knew that 1 degree of warming would mean the end of coral reefs, but there was no money in that. It didn't get much publicity. They did publish some papers way back when saying at 1 degrees we lose coral reefs, but all the money is basically on 2 degrees, which is a purely political choice. It wasn't chosen for good scientific reasons. Okay, so there's lots in there, but we'll move on, because one of the other things that's sort of just a structural problem with the science is that a lot of the things we're talking about are exponential. And the problem with exponential change, if you're especially trying to be, really scientific, is for a long time you're not even sure anything's happening. You're not getting a significant difference that can show up against just the random noise. Then you get to that bit in the middle where it's pretty clear something's happening, but you need a good scientific mathematical reason to move away from just assuming it's going to happen in a straight line. So you keep on making straight line predictions, but you keep on basically getting them wrong because it's exponential, right? this is what's happening with sea level rise. It's the prediction was sort of, maybe maximum of 1 metre. Well, then last year it went up to maybe maximum of 2.5 metres. And then I think it was the year before. And then the next year, last year, it went up to, maybe maximum of 4 metres. How are they getting it so wrong? It's because they're on that bit of the curve where you keep on making linear predictions on an exponential process. But they're bound to do that. That is the scientific method. You just don't leap to the conclusion that it's going to go exponential. You've got to be able to prove it. It means they're always going to be lagging behind. Same with tipping points. You don't really know when that little tree is going to give way. So you can easily get your prediction wrong. But when that little tree gives way, you're in big trouble, right? So we don't know if there's a point where the Earth is just going to warm out of control. We don't really know where it is and we don't really know when it is. But if it does it, it's a very, very large boulder, as the scientists said. So you can easily get tipping points wrong. You don't really know that you've tipped until it's passed. And that makes it very hard for scientists who are under immense pressure to get it right. But the bit I'm most interested in, obviously, as a psychologist, is the other main obstacle, which is cherry-picking the psychology. We don't like it when deniers cherry-pick the science, but people are cherry-picking the psychology, and that is really annoying the hell out of me. And it showed up really clearly in what's called the doom and gloom debate, right? So a very well-intentioned, very senior journalist, David Wallace-Wells, published an article. How many people actually read the thing? Oh, only a few. I think it was 2 million people read it. It was the most read article ever in the New Yorker. But the very day it came out, an eminent scientist said, look, he's got some of his facts wrong and we must not make people afraid. What he tried to do was basically he'd interviewed 20 scientists, this guy. Like he made a serious effort and he tried to do what basically no scientists really are doing, or very few scientists are doing at the moment. He tried to put together a worst-case scenario. And look, he got some things wrong, no doubt about that. But the main thing he was pilloried for was scaring people. He got fact-checked half to death by climate feedback. He was rated minus 0.7, just above an out-and-out lies Breitbart article. And he was labelled alarmist, imprecise, unclear and misleading. But he then published another version of his article with line-by-line explanations of where he got his assertions from. And look, there was one that was clearly wrong. I think there's really only one. And I just totally agree with him that it doesn't seem plausible that there is more risk in scaring people than there is in basically not scaring them enough. If there's only a 1% chance that we've set off a chain reaction that will destroy human civilisation, if not the planet, then we need to be able to mention this fact. Where did this view come from, that we must not scare people? I have a suspicion, and I can't prove this, that it actually came from someone who was not in the least well-intentioned. This guy, Frank Luntz, Republican spin doctor and poll pusher. Okay, so he does spin for the Republican Party. That's the main thing he did back in early 2000. It's the main thing he still does. That's him on Fox News quite recently. So back in 2003, he told George Bush to stop using the global warming, start talking about climate change. And because climate change suggests it's a more controllable and less emotional challenge. Plus, it fits great into the climate change deniers. Climate is always changing. We've got climate change. Every time we go climate change, we're just reinforcing their meme. Climate is always changing. So Bush stopped using global warming, and blow me down, the climate movement stopped using it as well. How often do you hear global warming now compared with climate change? The other thing he said to the Republicans is the scientific debate is closing against us, but not yet closed. You need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate. Focus on the science, demolish the science, or you will lose, he said. Okay, that was in 2003. So then, foolishly, I think, Obama employed this guy to tell Obama what Obama should do in his campaign, and he said to Obama the exact opposite. He said, don't mention the science. Focus on, no, not jobs and growth, but jobs and clean energy. Don't scare people. And Obama did it. And he told the US climate groups, don't scare people. You've got to talk about jobs and clean energy. And somewhere about the same time, the Australian climate movement started spreading this thing about don't scare people. And I don't know if it all came from Frank Luntz. I don't know where it exactly came from. But it has spread like a virus from this point. Some years after that, there was a booklet that was referred to over and over called, it's called Sizzle, the New Climate Emergency. And it's had pages like that early in the piece. Threats of climate hell have not seemed to hold us back from running headlong towards it. They built their booklet on this guy, Elmer Wheeler, who actually was talking about steak, not sausages. It's always talked to about as sell the sizzle anyway. Now, the interesting thing about Elmer Wheeler, well, first of all, he wasn't a psychologist and he wasn't a researcher, but he was a really good salesman. So was he saying use positive messages only? No. He was just saying sell with emotion. And even if you read through the rest of Sizzle, the climate one, it basically says tell people it's going to be hell if we don't act and tell them it's going to be heaven if we do. Threat, hope. Threat, hope. That's what the main message actually is. But if you look at what's featured in their full-page quotes, you take away the exact opposite message, which is exactly what a large part of the climate movement did. They said these guys are saying you must make our clean energy future sizzle and only talk about that. It's not what Elmer Wheeler said, and it's not even what this report said. This is one that's quoted a lot too. This is Apocalypse Soon, Dire Messages Reduce Belief in Global Warming by Contradicting Just World Beliefs. That's the title, right? That was in 2011. So what did they compare? What was their dire message and their positive message? Always you've got to look at what is compared. It was not in the article. So the average person who goes to read the article just reads the heading, reads the summary, it reads pretty much like this. What were they comparing? They were comparing two messages which were identical in their description of the science. Serious science, serious science. In the dire message, the last sentence was, and scientists say there is no hope. And in the positive message, they say, you know, it's all really serious, and scientists say there are things we can do. Well, who would have thought the second one would be better? One of the questions they ask is, well, after reading this, how much do you trust scientists? Well, the last sentence was scientists say that there's no hope, which is not sort of true. And then you ask, how much do you trust scientists? This is a terrible study. But until you actually get onto the authors and request the actual text that they use, you don't know that. So instead it's a spread all through the climate movement as some sort of gospel truth, that you mustn't scare people. This is not what this shows. This is something that David Spratt quotes. Basically, people in their hearts are already scared. Like, it is amazing the apocalyptic beliefs that are through society. There's a whole lot up there. I won't read them all out. Does that mean that we shouldn't scare them anymore? Or is it more like, you know, like you're in a marriage, the parents are fighting horribly, the kids are starting to get scared that the parents might divorce, they've got all these apocalyptic fears, so we won't just talk about it. Well, that'll make them a lot more relaxed, won't it? No. If you've got apocalyptic fears, you actually need to have them discussed. You need to discuss the question, is there a solution? Can we do stuff? It needs to be out in the open, not in the back of people's minds as this terrible weight of fear. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the psychology. I'm going to keep moving. So this is, again, another one of my favourites. This actually comes from a messaging book, but it is really consistent with what we used at the mental health service where I worked. How do people change? How do people move? What moves people to action? Well, it's like a little puny rider, which is our thoughts in the front of our brain, on a great big elephant, which is the emotions in the back of our brain and the bits we share with animals, all about survival and sex and food and basic stuff like that. And so you've got to motivate the elephant. And another curious one is shaping the path. This is from a book called Switch. And there's a very interesting study there just comparing the effect of putting a map on a brochure about donating. So they compared really selfish people with really generous people and asked all of them to donate some food for some starving people somewhere. They found the biggest difference was not between the generous people and the not so generous people. It was between the people who got a map about where to go and leave their food and the people who didn't get a map. So this thing of telling people exactly what they need to do, making it doable, is actually really important as well. Now, just in terms of this thing about fear doesn't work, have a think of the public health campaigns you know. Like, if you keep smoking, you might die, you can quit. If you speed through the suburbs, you might kill a small girl, slow down. If you don't wear a seatbelt, you might fly through the windscreen and get brain damage, put on a seatbelt. If you have unprotected sex, the Grim Reaper will get you and you'll get AIDS, but you can wear a condom. They all pretty much have the same basic structure, high threat, personally relevant to you, you might die, there is something you can do about it. It works like a charm. This is a meta-analysis of 152 studies in the public health sector, and it shows that they're effective. There are very few circumstances in which they're not effective, and there are no circumstances out of those 152 studies where they backfire. And look, the main thing is trust our experience. Have a look at the campaigns that work. Do they use fear? Of course they bloody use fear. Do they use anger? Well, that's not relevant in the public health sphere, but it's very relevant. Justified anger, righteous anger. Things are unfair. People are doing bad stuff. We must rise up and do something. It works fine. How would the Stop Adani campaign be going if we weren't angry with Adani and angry with the federal government and probably angry with the Queensland government as well? When people say don't have kids or, don't drive your car, and you're living out in the suburbs, personal guilt is very ineffective. When the plastics industry wanted to defeat container return legislation, they launched Keep America Beautiful. It's not our problem that we make all our drinks in plastic containers and you can't return them. It's your problem because you litter. And until you stop littering, we're going to have a litter problem. It's a calculated strategy by our opponents to individualise the problem. In the women's liberation movement, we used to say, beware the individual solution. If you spend all your energy, on walking around with unshaved armpits and hairy legs and no bra because you're trying to make a point, but you feel really stressed and unhappy by it, and you're so stressed and unhappy about it, you can't join a campaign for minimum wages or abortion rights or anything like that, you've got your priorities in the wrong place. We need to join together and do social change, not burn ourselves out with individual change. Look, if you can, put solar panels on your roof or something, great, but don't burn yourself out with individual change. That's what they want. And look, if we tell people it's really, really bad, there are some people who'll be sad and there are some people who'll despair. It's not a reason to stop. Some people will despair for a while and then get over it. Some people will despair and not get over it. But if we don't tell people, then the people who might have taken action won't know. We can't really tell the truth without upsetting ourselves and other people. It is a very sad situation we're in. We need to connect to values. And like I said, everyone's values are pretty much the same. So this is a quote. We went door knocking in Reservoir, fairly low income part of Reservoir, because Martin Ferguson dared us. He said, their asses are hanging out of their pants. You go and door knock there and they'll eat you for breakfast. So we did, because, he dared us basically. And look, what we found is even people who are struggling with their power bills, what they would say is, look, tell Martin we want subsidies or help to get solar panels on our roof, but This is a quote from one of them. Coal and gas are going to keep going up and up in price. Wind and solar are free. It just says common sense. And anyway, we've got to do stuff to save the planet for our kids. Just because you're poor and you're worried about your power bills doesn't mean you don't care about your kids' future. High threat, high efficacy. We need to tell people how bad it is, but we've got to, it's not as easy as just quitting smoking, is it? We've got to give them a path to success. We need a realistic path forward with the technology. Well, that's what people like BZE have been working on for years. But look, we need a realistic path forward politically. We need hope that we can win the politics, not just the technology. I do love We Are the 99%. Occupy grew from nothing to massive in just a matter of weeks. And it's still influencing. Talk about inequality is now so much stronger than just before the incredible few weeks where Occupy went from nothing to big. All right, so look, another just bit of psychology that we'll touch on is in the back of our brain, where all that emotion is and where the gateways to deciding what action to take is all lodged, is all the sorts of stuff about if you are abandoned by the herd, if you're left by the herd, the wolf will get you. So we're herd animals. It's not because we're sort of stupid and sheep-like. Sorry, sheep are nice too. It's not because we're stupid. It's because bred into us from when we were animals is that if you are isolated from the herd, you are at risk of death. So people follow each other for good reason. If we think there's something happening, we look around and go, well, are other people reacting? It's because that's a survival strategy. If other people are running, even if we can't work out why, we'd better off run, than hang around and look. So we've got to access that emotional part of the brain. We need some emotion in our messages. When there's a war or something, the newspapers who used to do that sort of science thing of trying to sort of be objective and unemotional, tend to get emotional. That's how people know it's a crisis, because people in power and usually unemotional sources are getting emotional. And look, our opponents, they don't hold back. When did you ever hear a measured, polite, unemotional climate change denier? 3-word slogans. Trust your experience. Do 3-word slogans work? Of course they work. They work for Abbott, but they work for us as well. Lock the gate. Farms not gas. Save the reef. No dam. Clean solar. Some of them are 2 words. Quit coal. Stop Adani. Right? If you can condense your campaign into a word or 3, you have so much more chance of winning than if you go, we really should stay below 2 degrees because that's the threshold for dangerous climate change, and that's what Paris said, and we sort of agreed to Paris, but Paris... Anyway, you know what I mean. If you can't sum it up in 2 words, it's probably not going to happen. So lots of other people use, 1 or 2 or 3 words: equal love, change the date, right to choose, and resist. In America, resist, 1 word. Black Lives Matter, there's endless number and they're all the same. 1, 2, 3, 4 words, that's about it. Now, this is another really, really important scientific, psychological fact, which also is incredibly well tested in the advertising sector. That is, the reason I've got a spinning wheel there is there's an amazing study where they sat someone down with a random wheels number. They spun the wheel, came up with some number, right? Random, irrelevant. Then they asked them, how many African nations are there in the United Nations? A completely and obviously unrelated question. And yet, the number that had come up on the spinning wheel influenced their guess. When you hear a number, your brain doesn't allow you to ignore it. Same thing with a TV set. You want to sell a $600 TV set? You put it in between the $800 TV set and the $400 TV set, because we just can't help assuming that the truth and the best buy is in the middle. Ambit claims, negotiations for wages. Ambit claim from the union, I'm not going to give you anything from the boss, end up in the middle. So we don't do this, though. We're so moderate. We're so, it could be this and it couldn't be that. Could be that. We're so careful. We have spent what was called the critical decade. It was called the critical decade because that's when we had to get to zero emissions, between 2010 and 2020. That's what Beyond Zero Emissions was working on. That's what the transition decade was working on. We didn't win, though, did we? We spent the decade arguing with the deniers. It's real. No, it's not. It's real. No, it's not. It's real. No, it's not. So somehow in really super quick time, especially since we've only got, 2 more years of the critical decade left, we've got to somehow shift. Oh, you can't see it very well. There's a middle bit in here, which is it's real versus an emergency. We've got to skip past it's real versus an emergency to the debate, which is it's an emergency, and if we mobilise a massive set of actions, we can progress, we can win on it, versus we're too late. This is the debate we need to have right now. We need to skip the is it an emergency or isn't it an emergency because of that unconscious averaging. If we keep on going, it's an emergency, it's an emergency, it's an emergency, eventually people will move towards us. It's what the deniers do all the time. They go, not happening, not happening, not happening, not happening. They never move towards us. We've got to go emergency, 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 and then not the deniers because they're paid, but ordinary society will move towards us. So, how do we do that? The way we try and tell the truth about it now is by saying climate change is real, dangerous, and it's already happening, right? So, it's happening, houses falling in the sea, bushfires, coral, droughts and things. But how many people really think this is going to get them? How many people just think, oh, well, I better not buy a Sydney beach house on the shore? Well, they're probably not going to anyway. How many people think, oh, well, I better not build in a bushfire-prone area? How many people think, oh, I better just get a few, shutters for extreme winds and things? And how many people think, oh, well, probably food's going to be a bit more expensive, but I'll cope? So these are arguments that are very effective for moving people to it's happening. But how many are really of the stop smoking or you'll die type impact? The reef, I think, is a bit different. I think the reef bleaching was the first time a lot of people realised that we might have done some irreparable harm to something that we loved. It's not to us personally, although it sort of is, because, pretty much all of us want to go and visit the reef and all that sort of stuff, and they want our kids to visit the reef. So I think there was something different about the reef. Sometimes you can capture it in a graph. This is one we did from 2008. I'm wondering, I don't know exactly what we've got to say that is more personally relevant and in a sense more scary, but I think people dying or things like people running out of water. We nearly ran out of water in Melbourne. If we hadn't built the desal plant and the drought had gone a few more years, we would have run out. And this would have been us. This is the water already in Venice. If we're looking at, 1, 2, 3, 4 metres, Venice is going to be underwater. You might be able to build a seawall, 4 metres high, but you might not really. One of the things I shared that got the most sort of likes on Facebook was an article called 60 Harvests. We're destroying the soil so fast that we actually only have 60 harvests left in it. We've got to actually repair the soil, even if we didn't have climate change. That seems to actually get through to people. Food. It's down there in the back of the brain, food. In Europe, heat waves killed tens of thousands of people. I searched for a picture. I could not find a picture of anybody. Imagine if it had been a terrorist attack, how many pictures we would have seen of tens of thousands of people dying. The only one I could find was this one. People die, but we don't see their faces. We don't hear their stories, so we don't sort of care that much because it's not us. And we really don't think it's going to happen to us because hopefully we can afford air conditioning. Mass migration, people say we're not meant to talk about it because it makes people into sort of right-wingers. But look, we're going to end up with so much mass migration that we're not going to be able to bring them here, not millions of people, and we're not going to be able to stop the boats, not millions of people. I think we could actually talk about it a bit more, frankly. Especially since it's already happening. There's 2 million Bangladeshis already fled to India. And India, we hear a lot about Trump's fence. India's already built a fence. And they're shooting 800 a year that try and go over it. Quite a lot get over, but 800 a year get killed. They already haven't got enough land in Bangladesh. And sea level rise is just going to wipe out a large part of their delta where they grow stuff. The threat multiplier for conflict. We've had the same problem. People go, oh, you can't blame climate change for the Syrian war. There's all these other factors. But fortunately, we've come up with a phrase, which is threat multiplier, which the American defence agrees with. So I think we've really got to stop talking about climate change. We don't know what the best is, but, something like climate emergency, climate crisis, irreparable damage. we've got to stop talking about Paris targets. Like, people don't even know what they are, let alone have any visceral emotional reaction to them. So I'll just go quickly through anger. Like, it's not so widespread, but there is a sort of thing about don't be angry, don't encourage people to be angry. It's sort of not nice. I think we've got to. I asked a journalist, what should we do to promote the climate emergency message? He said, you've got to target Murdoch more. He is a large part of the problem and you're just letting him off the hook. We've got to tell the story. Like, 83 individuals own more than half the world's population. How is this going to work? And it's really just 1,000 corporations that are doing the biggest job of completely destroying the planet. Shouldn't we at least mention them? From the women's movement, we used to sing a song. Don't be too polite, girls, don't be too polite. Why? Because we were prone to be too nice and we had to sort of rev ourselves up a bit just to go, we want this. I think sometimes the climate movement is too polite. We've got to rev ourselves up a bit and go, look, this is not acceptable. There's a book at the moment just come out called Unprecedented Crime. I think that's the sort of language we need to talk about. These people, so they can leave a few more billion to their kids, are prepared to destroy the planet. We need some strong language on that, not this. Not just, oh, well, they've got right-wing values, we've got to try and talk to them. Please, no. Okay, tipping points is really hard, like I said. It's hard to know exactly where they are, but I think we've got to mention them. This was the graph that I saw, which turned me into a climate activist. I'm a sort of graphy kind of person. It was when I realised the Arctic ice had dropped off the prediction curve. This is the one we used at the start of the campaign to declare a climate emergency. And again, for graphic people, I think, it's quite alarming. It was when the temperature spiked to plus 1.6 degrees of warming in 2016, same time the reef was bleaching. I think if we're talking about unstoppable melt, we should always at least explain to people what it means for our cities. Like, it's all very well, some little beach town, you might have to retreat, back up, a kilometre or two. How's Melbourne going to retreat? I mean, seriously, how's South Bank going to retreat? Where are the people of St Kilda going to go? It's not like someone else is just going to move out and say, hi guys, you can have my place. This is one of Hanson's attempts. Apparently there's some possibility this great big thing was shifted in a superstorm in times gone past that are similar to the times we're setting up for the planet to come. Like, it's not just like you need storm shutters in these things. It's like a giant boulder might land on your house. Anyway, I don't know where that one works, but people are increasingly talking about the breakdown of human civilisation as a risk. Well, that's something that affects everybody, and it even affects the rich people. Because, like, you might still survive in your gated community down in Antarctica somewhere, but it's just not going to be as much fun. So this was a climate scientist back in 2010. And the first part of that is, he said, climate scientists don't readily get emotional, but now they're speaking out. Why? Because virtually all of us are now convinced that global warming poses a clear and present danger to civilisation. This is stronger than what that poor bloody David Wallace-Wells said. And here's another one from Professor Kevin Anderson. If you hit 4 or 5 or 6 degrees, you might have 500 million people surviving. That's billions of people dead. I don't think calling it an uninhabitable planet is too strong if you're talking about billions of people dying. And look, it's interesting, like, we don't have a picture. Like, they're saying, civilisation might break down. What does that actually look like? Well, we like to think that Mad Max is just sort of, fantasy, but, like, if civilisation breaks down, maybe it does look a bit like that. So, look, this was my sort of personal aha moment. Back in 2007, when David Spratt and Philip Sutton were doing their research for Climate Code Red, one of the things that really affected me was their account that they had been in the chat rooms of scientists, and at that point scientists were already talking about, should we move our families sort of to the south of Tasmania or the south of New Zealand? So, look, anyway, after a while I started thinking, well, I better get some land for my kids in Tasmania, and plant a bit of an orchard and all that sort of stuff. But then someone said, well, and are you going to teach them how to use a machine gun too? Like, if it gets that bad, the fact that you own land in Tasmania is going to be irrelevant. So, look, We don't need to dwell on worst-case scenarios. It's like getting house insurance. We don't need to dwell on the house burning down. Don't need to dwell on the house burning down, but we need to think about it enough so we do what's needed. So we need just some language to talk about this. And I don't really think we should call anything the new normal, because the thing about exponentiality is that we don't stabilise. So we've got to shape the path. We've got to give people a sense of the way forward. We've got to have a clear vision of what achieving zero emissions fast, what it would look like. We've got that pretty much. But we need also a very clear vision of what it looks like to achieve massive drawdown. And we don't really know what that looks like, although there's great stuff on later in the day about how soil, carbon, biochar and that sort of thing might contribute. All the solutions basically are path to a better world in terms of just the technology, but also in terms of the politics. We actually have to build a fairer, more democratic world to win on this. So it's all upside in terms of everything we do is going to make life better. We need best case scenarios, not just worst case scenarios. Yeah. And so there's stuff like, whether we can build massive kelp farms that actually de-acidify the ocean. We don't know yet if we can. But I think it's good to tell the story because good stuff can happen as well as bad stuff. So, yeah, soil carbon might save us, it might not. But let's tell the story. Let's keep hope alive. This is an amazing story. Who was at the great debate last night? So you heard this story at the protest camp. It's trying to save the part of the Tarkine. Is that right? The Florentine forest. They arrested all the protesters. They'd been there for months or years. And the day they arrested them and the forest was completely unprotected and the log trucks were coming in to start cutting down these enormous, beautiful trees, a 600-year-old tree fell across the path and stopped them. You couldn't have predicted it, but sometimes good stuff happens. And, yeah, another one that Kelly O'Shaughnessy told last night is just the story of it became dubbed the little coral that could. That as soon as we stop just destroying stuff, it starts trying to grow back. So we've got to move into emergency mode. This is a thing we don't talk about, but it makes a big difference. And again, like when we're working together on something really, really important, in some ways it's a good time. Yeah, it's going to have to be like the scale of World War II stuff at home. But people don't like that as a way of expressing it. We've got to find another way of telling people. We've got to tell the story of big change that have happened in the past. And like I said, we need realistic hope about politics, not just the technology. Podemos, in the first 20 days in Spain, 100,000 signed up, young people mainly, wanting a better, fairer future. And it quickly grew to nearly 500,000. And they've been big players in Spanish politics since. The climate mobilisation folks got this stuff into the Democrats' platform. No one has heard about it, but they've got a World War II type national mobilisation to save civilisation from catastrophic consequences in the Democratic platform now. How good is that? There's people getting arrested and killed in places around the world fighting for the same stuff we are. It only takes 3.5% of the population really putting their bodies on the line to topple even an evil dictator. So we've got to stop just saying stuff that's not true, like we've got a remaining carbon budget. And we've got to find a catchy way to say zero plus drawdown that people can actually understand. So circulating is this petition. That's sort of just the start of trying to do something about this. We're collecting signatures again. All sorts of famous people are actually supporting the campaign, but they're mostly passive. We need active support from powerful people, as well as more than the 20,000 that we've got of ordinary people. So, look, later in the day, there's more about how we've used the climate emergency in messaging around, especially in Darebin Council and in state and federal elections in that area. Oh, there's one of our councillors. Oh, there's two of our councillors. Okay. And the Save the Planet people. We've been very successful. Like, even if you're a Labor candidate now, you stand up on the stage in Darebin and you go, I believe it's a climate emergency. It's unacceptable to be anything except someone who recognises it's an emergency. Darebin's now declared a climate emergency. And look, if by signing the petition, you are actually signing up to be part of a campaign, and we've got ideas about how to progress this in the coming year. So accept your thoughts and feelings, choose action in line with your values, and be sure to bloody join us and do some stuff. Thank you.